The difference between Poland and Russia is a vibrant, dynamic Jewish community. I was in Moscow on Simchas Torah night. There were 1,000 people there. There were 13 oligarchs in the room. Their net worth was $30-some-odd billion. Now, what shul in America has people worth $30 billion in the shul for dancing? At 3:30, at 4, so we were dancing till 11 o'clock, and then we had a break, and then we had the dancing again. At 3 o'clock in the morning, we went on the street, and at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm walking home with Rabbi Lazar. You'd think he'd be impressed that he had these oligarchs worth $30 billion. He said to me, I had success tonight. I said, what was your success? He says, 3 guys decided to get a bris, and 3 guys or 4 guys decided to put on tefillin. But we're talking here a different kind of world. You know, there was a row of Mercedes in front of the shul, each guy with a driver and bodyguards, and these guys are dancing inside like everybody else. They run the economy of Russia. The difference is we're the Jewish establishment in Russia. There's no Jewish Federation. We are the Jewish Federation. There's no ADL. We are the ADL. There's no AJC. We are the AJC. Judaism in Russia is run 98% by Chabad. It's a different ballgame. It is the most amazing Jewish community that I've ever been to in my life. It is so well organized. There's schools in this town with 1,000 students, with 50,000 Jews. It's an amazing place. I mean, now there's challenges, and everything in the city is run by Jews. The shopping centers are owned by Jews. Both airlines are owned by a Jew. The banks are owned by Jews. The gas stations are owned by Jews. The whole downtown, everything is owned by these oligarchs. In fact, the governor now, on behalf of Ukraine, is one of these oligarchs. One of the other elements for the success of Judaism in Russia, even though he's not so popular right now in the United States, has been the friendship to the Jewish world of the president of Russia, which is Vladimir Putin. And you have to ask yourselves, why is this so? I heard a great line from a professor of mathematics, Novosibirsk. He told me like this: Putin may not be good for Russia, but he's definitely good for the Jews of Russia.
The Jewish Religion, Its Influence Today, by Elizabeth Dilling. Chapter 12, The Jews and the Communization of Russia. Very few people are aware of the extent to which Jews were responsible for the communization of Russia, first through organizing of the unsuccessful revolution of 1905, and then the later and successful Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Both were heavily financed by outside Jewish financial and banking houses, and ultimately resulted in Jews assuming control of what had become the Russian Soviet government. Concurrently, Jewish machinations in the United States, Germany, and elsewhere helped set the stage for the takeover. This Jewish control still exists, despite propaganda to the contrary designed to delude and deceive non-Jews. Long prior to the revolution of 1905, Jews had conceived a hatred of Christian and Tsarist Russia because of opposition of the Russian people and government to Jewish Talmudism. In his introduction to the 1903 translation of the Talmud, for example, Rotkinson details the repeated denunciations of the Talmud over many centuries by nearly every country, the popes, and others, and also states, quote, "Still what has been the result? The Talmud exists today, and not one letter in it is missing. It is true, the persecutions against it are not yet at an end. Accusations and calumnies by its enemies under the new name of anti-Semites are still directed against it, while the government of Russia legislates against and restricts the rights of the nation which adheres to the Talmud." End quote. One of the prime Jewish conspirators plotting to communize Russia was Jacob Schiff, who became head of the enormously powerful New York Jewish banking house of Cohn Loeb and Company. Turn to the laudatory sketch of Jacob Schiff in the Jewish Communal Kehillah Register of New York City, 1917 through 1918, of which Kehillah was an executive committee man. It is stated there how German-born Schiff came to America and made connections with a banking house. Quote, "In 1873, he returned to Europe where he made connections with some of the chief German banking houses, and the firm of Cohn, Loeb and Company floated the large Japanese war loans of 1904 through 1905, thus making possible the Japanese victory over Russia." End quote. The last paragraph boasts, quote, "Mr. Schiff has always used his wealth and his influence in the best interest of his people. He financed the enemies of autocratic Russia." This is written in 1918 after the Bolshevik Revolution had been made secure, "and used his financial influence to keep Russia from the money market of the United States." End quote. It is stated that all factions of Jewry hailed him for this. Quote, today, it is estimated by Jacob's grandson, John Schiff, a prominent member of New York society, that the old man sank about $20 million for the final triumph of Bolshevism in Russia. End quote. This quote is from the Heart Press of February 3rd, 1949. Title, The Jewish Bankers. The great Jewish banking monopolies have been interwoven by marriage like a rug. Note 3 things about the Rothschilds in Exhibit 298, which is from the Jewish Encyclopedia of 1905, point 1, that of the 58 Rothschild marriages to that date, exactly half, or 29, had been to first cousins. This appears in the right-hand column. 2, that the Rothschilds were the first to make use of journalistic methods to arouse the interest of the public in their loans. They have, however, consistently kept the secret of their own operations. Point 3, a major reason why Russia collapsed and went under the red heel during World War I also appears in this exhibit, namely, of recent years, the Rothschilds have consistently refused to have anything to do with loans to Russia, owing to the anti-Jewish legislation of that empire. End quote. The Warburg International Jewish banking family has also been closely connected with the Schiffs and the Rothschilds. James Paul Warburg, in his sketch in Who's Who in American Jewry, 1938 through 1939, states, quote, born Hamburg, Germany, of August 18th, 1896, paternal ancestors through 6 generations have been bankers as members of the banking house of M.M. Warburg and Company, founded in Hamburg, 1798. Maternal grandfather, Solomon, founder of International Banking House of Kuhn-Loeb and Company, came to the U.S. in 1902. End quote. Paul M. Warburg had married Jenny Nina Loeb, mother of James Paul. Jacob Schiff, after coming to the U.S., had married Teresa Loeb, sister of Nina and daughter of the Kuhn-Loeb founder. Schiff's daughter, Frida, married Felix M. Warburg, Hamburg-born banker who headed the Agro Joint Work for Jewry in Russia to help keep them in power after the Red Revolution. Their daughter, Carola, married Walter M. Rothschild. Felix M. Warburg and Paul M. Warburg of Kuhn-Loeb and Company, partners of Jacob Schiff, were brothers of Max Warburg of Hamburg, Germany, the payoff man and power with the Kaiser, who funneled funds to Lenin and Trotsky during World War I to undermine and destroy the Russian government. Jacob Schiff received his banking training in his father's business, he being a Rothschild agent and associate. The basement of the 2-in-a-row houses of Schiff and Rothschild, which I visited in Frankfurt on Main, Germany, was one room in common with a joint getaway, which formerly had led beyond a ghetto wall. The little shack at the back was where kings, hat in hand, would come to get Jewish loans. The original name of Bauer had been abandoned for Red Shield, Rothschild, and a red shield hung out as an address sign at the front of the house. A ship sign for Schiff hung outside the Schiff house, built along the same common wall. Each house was about the width of an entrance hall. The room back of the Rothschild kitchen was a tiny synagogue when I was there in 1934. A skull-capped Jew was the guide who collected entrance fees for showing the houses, the Rothschild house being the chief attraction. A gambling table was the main piece of furniture in the front room in the upstairs of the Rothschild house. 2 rooms of each floor comprised the house. Quote, when the Kehillah, also known as the Jewish Community of New York, was organized in 1909, the control rested with a group of German Jews, including Jacob Schiff, president of the Kuhn-Loeb and Company, a branch of the Bleichroder Mendelssohn Bank affiliated with the Big D banks in Germany. In Germany, the leading private bankers included the Mendelssohns and Bleichroders, who were bankers to Emperor William I, Bismarck, and the early industrialists. Frankfurt, the mother city of Jewish bankers, produced its Lazards, Speyers, Stearns, Dreyfuses, and Solbachs, as well as sending abroad one Jacob Schiff. End quote. The same source continues, quote, "Toward the end of that period, the House of Warburg and Hamburg played an important part not only in the finances but destinies of Germany. Max Warburg was advised to the government at the Versailles Peace Conference. Karl I, Melchior, another member of the firm, headed the financial section of the Armistice Commission in 1918 through 1919, and was one of the 6 German delegates to Versailles." End quote. Elsewhere, through the State Department documents, you will note the role played by the M.M. Warburg banking firm in financing the Red Russian Revolution. And, when Max Warburg came here from Hamburg in 1939, the American Jewish Committee placed him on its post-war committee for the recognition of the world, which in turn set up the propaganda claque from the ensuring United Nations. And so, down through the decades, Kunlock and international bankers, princes of Jewry, remold the world toward the ultimate aim, world Jewish dictatorship, now so rapidly coming about. Title: The Kaiser. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany and his government were used during World War I by Jews such as Max Warburg to channel funds into Russia to breed disaffection in the Russian army and navy and to set the stage for the ultimately successful Bolshevik Revolution. When Kaiser Wilhelm realized that he had been made a tool of Jewry, it was after the war was over and he was sawing or chopping wood at Doom, Holland. It was too late. Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent carried this article, July 9th, 1921, quote, "It is a most significant fact that, as in Washington, the most constant and privileged visitors to the White House were Jews, so in Berlin the only private telephone wire to the Kaiser was owned by Walter Rothenu, who later wrote the Constitution of the post-war Jew-controlled Weimar Republic. Not even the Crown Prince could reach the Kaiser except through the ordinary telephone connections. It was a family enterprise, this international campaign. Jacob Schiff swore to destroy Russia. Paul M. Warburg was his brother-in-law. Felix Warburg was his son-in-law. Max Warburg of Hamburg, banker of the Bolsheviks, was thus brother-in-law to Jacob Schiff's wife and daughter. Max Warburg represents the family in its native land. Max Warburg has as much to do with German war government as his family and financial colleagues had to do with the United States war government. As has been recounted in the press the world over, the brother from America and the brother from Germany both met at Paris as government representatives in determining the peace. There were so many Jews in the German delegation that it was known by the term kosher, also as the Warburg delegation, and there were so many Jews in the American delegation that the delegates from the minor countries of Europe looked upon the United States as a Jewish country, which through unheard of generosity had elected a non-Jew as its president. The Jews had several objectives in the war, and one of them was to get Russia. In this work, Max Warburg was a factor. His bank is noted in a dispatch published by the United States government as being one whence funds were forwarded to Trotsky for use in destroying Russia. Always against Russia, not for German reasons, but for Jewish reasons, which in this particular instance coincided. Warburg and Trotsky against Russia, while Otto Kahn, another partner in Kuhn, Locke and Company, denounced pro-German propaganda. His partner Paul was playing the German symphony string. It is a great international orchestra, this Jewish financial firm. It can play the Star-Spangled Banner, Die Wacht am Rhein, the Marseillaise and God Save the King in one harmonious rendering, paying obsequious attention to the prejudices of each." End quote. Thus spoke Ford Paper in 1921. Title: Jews in Russian Revolution of 1905. The New York Communal Register of 1917 through 1918 related the actions of the American Jewish Committee in the U.S. to protect Russian Jewish revolutionaries. In 1909, so many red revolutionary criminals had fled to this country from the Jewish war against Christian Russia that the committee fought to keep two of them, Poirier and Rudovitz, here. Quote, "The committee appreciated the bearing of their cases upon a large number of Jews who had taken part in the Russian Revolution, and who had sought or might seek an asylum in this country, and in cooperation with others succeeded in defeating the attempt of Russia." End quote. The others referred to included Secretary of State Elihu Root, who, despite the fact that no substantial evidence was produced before the committing magistrate that the offenses charged against Poirier were political, therefore, under the law, he could be extradited, delayed in deciding the case until it could be changed in Poirier's favor. Title: Rutenberg and the Russian Revolution. We see in Exhibit 224 how the 1917 through 1918 Jewish Kahila Report boasted of Pinchas Rutenberg as a founding force in the American Jewish Congress, as well as his being in the right-hand man to Jewish Premier Kerensky in the 1917 Russian Revolution. Mourning the death of its founder, Pinchas Rutenberg, the American Jewish Congress publication, the Congress Weekly, stated in an article on January 16th of 1942 titled "Rutenberg's Mission to America," quote, "His role in the birth of the American Jewish Congress was immense. The young Russian intellectual, in other words, revolutionist, soon made his influence felt in the underground council of the Social Revolutionary Party. Rutenberg was the man who, in 1905, piloted the revolutionary activities of the notorious Father Gapin, and then sat in judgment and brought about his execution. In Italy, during the First World War, he got in touch with Vladimir Jabotinsky, founder of the Jewish Legion. In New York, in 1915, he got in touch with the representatives of the Social Revolutionary Party there, Dr. Chaim Zitlowski and Dr. Samuel Ellsberg, who were now interested in the Palestine Party, Palestine and Jewish rights." End quote. Title: Father Gapin. The above Father Gapin incident is typical of applied Judaism. The dramatic prayer addressed by Gapin to the Tsarist government, with the threat that if it were not granted, "we shall die here on the square before thy palace," combined with mutinies, strikes involving more than 2 million people, are related in William Henry Chamberlain's The Russian Revolution of 1917 through 1921. We read, quote, "Gapin himself was doubtful about the wisdom of bringing large masses to present this petition, yet Gapin was pushed ahead as the leader. Then, when the demonstrators refused to obey orders to disperse and go home, volleys of rifle fire poured on them. The casualties of Bloody Sunday are estimated at from 200 to 1,500, end quote. That the Jew Rutenberg, quote, piloted the revolutionary activities of the notorious Father Gapin, then sat in judgment and brought about his execution, end quote, is not mentioned by historian Chamberlain, who was correspondent for 12 years in Russia for the leftist-oriented Christian Science Monitor, and now writes for the New Jewish Line anti-communist Human Events. He also serves as contributing editor of the Socialist Social Democratic Federation Party's magazine, New Leader. Rutenberg was chosen in 1937 as one of the 120 leading Jews of the world, along with Litvinov, Finkelstein, the Soviet Commissar, and Rabbi Louis Finkelstein. head of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. He died in Palestine in 1942, much mourned, having set up the Palestine Electric Corporation, using huge water rights issued under British protection for the use of Jewry. Title: More Jewish Manipulations of the U.S. No corner of the earth has been too remote to manipulate for Jewry. We note activities of the American Jewish Committee concerning the Jews in the Balkans after 1913, and our government was used again to pressure for Jewish power. Exhibit 229 shows how restriction of immigration from Russia was fought by the American Jewish Committee after 1906, so that the flow of revolutionaries might not be curbed. The literacy test was fought so that the illiterate Jews might swarm here, as they did. Of 3 literacy test bills, we are told President Taft vetoed 1 and President Wilson 2 under pressure of the American Jewish Committee. And then, when one of them was passed, despite the veto, the committee succeeded in procuring adoption of a clause which excluded those who came to this country to avoid religious persecution, whether induced by overt acts, oppressive laws, or by governmental relations. The cry of persecution has always been used to cover the crimes of the only people on earth whose very religion teaches them that murder and enslavement and cheating of all other peoples is a sacred right. We are told in the New York Jewish Communal Register that the American Jewish Committee considered it one of the most important functions to bend every effort toward the solution of the passport question. This solution was to circumvent Russia, which sought to bar Russian-born Red Jews who came to the USA to get citizenship so as to return to Russia as American citizens, from using their immunity to steer the Red Revolutionary overthrow of the Russian Christian government. Russia had instructed its consuls to inquire of any applicants for passports to enter Russia from the USA, and if they were Russian-born Jews, not to give them an entrance visa. The USA was at the time full of jailbird revolutionaries wanted in Russia, who thus sought to escape Russian law as American citizens. The aim of the American Jewish Committee was first to overthrow the Russian government, and later to sustain the Red Butchers as they enslaved the Christian populace. Note the sanctimonious hearts and flowers pose of the committee in Exhibit 231 about Russia, refusing to recognize the American passport in the hands of American citizens of the Jewish faith. And what is that holy faith? A criminal conspiracy against all humanity, against all civilized laws, all reciprocity, a code which makes that of gangsters seem benign. Title: Treaty with Russia broken. Too often unmentioned today is the fact that under Article 6 of the United States Constitution, a treaty becomes the supreme law of the land, and judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. At one stroke, thereby, all state laws, as well as the Constitution itself, may be legally nullified by a treaty. In our time, this has been done. The United Nations Charter, ratified by almost 100% of the Senate, became, as a treaty, the supreme law of the land. Anything in the Constitution or the laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. The machinery to nullify our freedoms, therefore, is in place. That the top American Jewish Committee was well aware of this provision of the Constitution back in 1917 through 1918, when the New York Kehillah Report was issued, is evident from the text. The Reciprocal Trade Treaty of 1832 with Russia had to be broken. It had permitted Russia to have some say as to those from the USA. It must admit through its borders. Russia retained some sovereignty, which Red Revolutionary Jewry from Russia, armed with American citizenship, could not hurdle. The Jewish mob must be free to return to Russia and put over the Jewish Revolution. The New York Kahila text states in Exhibit 231 and 232, quote, "The committee, after serious consideration, determined to recommend to the President the abrogation of the treaty with Russia, and on May 18, 1908, dispatched a letter to President Roosevelt. This began the attempt on the part of the organization to induce our government to take some effective action to terminate the controversy. Correspondence with the same end in view was also had with President Taft, and was supplemented by personal interviews with the President and with Secretaries of State, Root and Knox. The effect of the termination of the treaty was the declaration of the national policy of the United States that it would not tolerate further discrimination against American citizens of the Jewish faith. Since treaties are, under the Constitution, the supreme law of the land, with the termination of the treaty there no longer exists a law, which according to the Russian government's contention was susceptible of the unconstitutional construction that our government permitted discrimination against American citizens on account of race or religion. The action of President Taft and the Congress of the United States was subsequently approved by all the great political parties of the country in platform adopted by them in 1912 and again in 1916." End quote. More of the background of these pre-revolutionary activities of the American Jewish Committee, which was headed by Jacob Schiff, was covered in the Henry Ford Dearborn Independent in an article in January 1921 entitled, "Taft Once Tried to Resist Jews and Failed." To quote, "Mr. Taft once stood out against the Jews, was strongly denounced as unfavorable to the Jews, was soundly beaten by the Jews on a matter on which he had taken a firm stand, and has ever since shown that he has learned his lesson by accommodating the Jews in their desires. For centuries, Russia has had their own troubles with the Jews, and, as the world knows, has at last fallen prostrate before Jewish power, which for centuries has been working to undermine her. The biggest hoax in modern times was the propaganda against Russia as the persecutor of the Jews. Russia devoted to the Jews a large part of the most favored section of the land, and was always lax in those laws which prohibited Jews from settling in other parts of the country, that the Jew was able to create an underground system throughout the whole of Russia, which controlled the grain trade, controlled public opinion, and utterly baffled the Tsar's government. The cry of persecution aroused because the Jews were not permitted to exploit the peasants as much as they desired. They have, however, gained that privilege since." End quote. Reports of USA ministers are quoted showing that while 1,500 Jews were registered in St. Petersburg with the police, 30,000 were operating there illegally. Jewish editors and writers wielded power on the landing of newspapers of St. Petersburg and Moscow, and the liquor trade was entirely Jewish in hands. At every turn, the United States government discovered that Jews were exaggerating their difficulties for the purpose of forcing governmental action. The Jews represented that their life in Russia was a hell. Presently, after years of underground work and open propaganda against Russia in the daily press, until the American conception against Russia was fixed, almost beyond correction, the agitation took the form of the Russian passport question. Jews demanded nothing less than that the United States should break all treaty relations with Russia. They demanded it. How Jacob Schiff, Louis Marshall, Adolph Cross, and Judge Henry M. Fogel, executive committee members of the American Jewish Committee, walked in on President Taft at the White House February 15, 1911, is described. They had demanded the conference were dined at the White House luncheon table, but Taft insisted upon reading them his conclusions that the trade treaty of 1832 with Russia should not be broken, as an exceptional favor to Jews, despite his sentiments in favor of Jewry. Jacob Schiff was enraged. Quote, "This means war," he exclaimed. Quote, "On leaving the White House, Jacob Schiff refused to shake the president's hand, but brushed by it with an air of offended power. Neither did the president know what was behind it all. It meant that German Jews would be the intermediaries of trade between Russia and the United States if the treaty were broken. The Frankfurt bankers and their relatives in the United States knew what that meant. The relation meant power over Russia, and Jacob Schiff lived to overthrow Russia. The neutrality of the United States was torn to shreds by a movement organized and financed on American soil for the overthrow of a friendly nation, and the organizers and financiers were Jews. The United States was to be used as a crowbar to batter down the walls." When the Jewish ambassadors left the White House, orders flew from Washington and New York to every part of the United States, and the Jewish nagging drive began. It had a center in every city. It focused on every representative and senator. No official, however, was too mean or unimportant to be drafted. American editors can remember the drive. It was operated on precisely the same lines as the one which is proceeding against the press today. The Jews have given absolute proof in the last 2 months that they control the majority of the American press. Jacob Schiff had said on February 15th, "This means war." He had ordered a large sum of money used for that purpose on December 13th of that same year, almost 10 months to a day after a jury had declared war on President Taft's conclusions. Both houses of Congress ordered President Taft to notify Russia that the treaty with Russia would be terminated. Frankfurt on Main had won. 9 years later, at the writing of this article, it is noted that Taft is making speeches for the Jews after the Jewish press of the United States berated President Taft with Jewish unreserve. It would be an eye-opener if, at every speech which William Howard Taft makes for his Jewish clients, there could be distributed copies of the remarks printed about President Taft by those same Jewish clients 9 years ago. 2 governments had been beaten, and the glee with which Jewry hailed the event is also known." End quote. The fact that Taft was that strange phenomenon, a one-term president, is noted in the question raised that this might have been in consequence of his disobedience. Quote, "The president had really done what he could to prevent the Jewish plan from going through. On February 11th of 1911, he withstood them face to face. On December 13th, 1911, they whipped him. And yet, in the next year, 1912, a peculiar thing occurred. The high officials of the B'nai B'rith went to the White House, and there pinned on the breast of President Taft a medal which marked him as the man who had contributed most during the year to the welfare of the Jewish cause. There is a photographic stint of President Taft standing on the south portico of the White House in the midst of a group of prominent Jews, and the president is wearing his medal. He is not smiling. That is the story of William Howard Taft's efforts to withstand the Jews, and how they broke him. It is probably worth knowing in the view of the fact that he has become one of the Gentile fronts which Jews use for their own defense." End quote. At every stage of the game of takeover for Talmudism, the United States was used as a base of operations to put Christian Russia under heel. Propaganda flooded this country, which inculcated those of my vintage with a conviction that the weak czar, with his outnumbered, outfinanced foes, wielded a black snake whip over little angel Jews made to suffer just because they were people of the book. We were taught that to the tune of millions of dollars spent by the American Jewish Committee and others. You have only to read such Jewish books as Dubnow's History of the Jews of Russia and Poland, put out by the American Jewish Committee's Jewish Publication Society of America, for its own people to see how every law was flouted as the Talmudists rose to assassinate and crowd their way into complete mastery and butchery of Russia. Title: Ford apologizes to Jewry. Even one of the most wealthy and powerful men in the world was not immune to Jewish power and intimidation. The unqualified crawl, even the misstatement that he had been unaware of the contents of his Dearborn Independent, appeared over Henry Ford's signature, June 30th, 1927, just about 6.5 years after the above article appeared. The apology was addressed to Lewis Marshall as head of the American Jewish Committee. The renowned theologian Dr. James M. Gray, head of the Moody Bible Institute, wrote concerning this apology by Ford in the Moody Monthly of September 1927, quote, "This confession, in our opinion, is another link in the chain of prophecy. As we read it, we were impressed that the great millionaire went further than the circumstances of the case required him to do. To put it in another way, we do not believe the editor of the Independent, Mr. Ford's paper, was either foolish or as wicked as the confession of its proprietor would make him appear. We believe he had good grounds for publishing some of the things about the Jews, which he did publish. Indeed, the pressure brought to bear upon Mr. Ford to make his confession was in itself such corroborative evidence. This pressure came from Jews all over the world, and in the face of it, Mr. Ford was panic-stricken. He is one of the richest men in the world, and of course, conscious of the power that money brings with it. But he was made to feel that the Jews have more money, and hence more power, than he, and that in such a cause, their money and their power can be quickly mobilized against an opponent with crushing consequence." End quote. Dr. Gray knew what he was talking about, having been subjected to Jewish threats himself, but he refused to recant his assertions that the protocols of Zion represent the program of Talmudic world Jewry. I knew Dr. Gray. Large numbers of my book, The Red Network, were sold in the Moody bookstore. I spoke in the Moody church and over the Moody radio. Unfortunately, Dr. Gray's successor has quieted down many matters in favor of Jewry. Title: The Russian Revolution. Suppressed State Department Documents. Much authentication of the Jewish hand in the successful communization of Russia through the Revolution of 1917 is contained in official United States government documents, namely Papers Relating to the Foreign Relations of the United States, 1918, Russia, consisting of 3 volumes and published in 1931, including our many communications between the Secretary of State Lansing, U.S. Ambassador to Russia Francis, and various consular officials, detailing events as a moderate regime took over Russia under Jewish Premier Kerensky, who was then superseded in a few months by the bloody Bolsheviks, led by Jews such as Trotsky, his real name Bronstein, Zinoviev, real name Hirsch Apfelbaum, Kamenev, and Virdalov, are excerpts from these government documents. All through the State Department papers, most of which are not reproduced, is the picture of Russia in a state of economic collapse, as soldiers and sailors are being paid to demonstrate against the Christian government by Jewry, events which are followed by the final Red takeover. These documents are today suppressed for public view, and if you don't believe this to be so, try to obtain copies, or even to find them in any public library. The current Jewish line is that Soviet Russia is anti-Semitic, and organized Jewry has no desire to have our people learn of the true origins and beginnings of anti-Christian communist Russia. Title: The Revolution Begins. On March 15, 1917, Russian Tsar Nicholas II abdicated under revolutionary pressures, naming as Regent Grand Duke Michael until his son came of age. Not reproduced here is the communication the very next day from Secretary of State Lansing telling Ambassador Francis to call on Milyakov, Foreign Affairs Minister of the new government, and to state that the government of the United States recognizes the new government of Russia. to which Ambassador to Russia Francis replied that he had arranged to turn out his entire staff in full uniform to recognize the revolutionary regime. Also omitted here are reports showing the premiership of Prince Lvov, a sop to the royalty adoring Russians. All party functions of the left had unitedly put over the revolution, and this interim regime was to be short-lived indeed. 4 days after the Tsar's abdication, Ambassador Francis stated, "Financial aid, now from America, would be a masterstroke, immeasurably important to the Jews that revolution succeed." End quote. Title: Enter Kerensky. The premiership of Prince Lvov lasted only 2 months. To quote from the 1920 4-volume report of the New York State Committee investigating subversive activities, headed by Senator Clayton R. Lusk, quote, "Alongside of the provisional government, headed first by Prince Lvov, the socialist and anarchist elements of Petrograd's population established a Soviet of soldiers, workmen, and sailors' deputies. Its president was at first ChiRho, the Menshevik leader, and its vice president Kerensky, leader of the Socialist Social Revolution Party. In May 1917, the Soviet Kerensky's forced the resignation of the first cabinet. Kerensky then succeeded Prince Lvov, the first premier of the provisional government, who proved to be a weak and vacillating character. Kerensky was weak and vacillating, not because he did not show about the Lenin-Trotsky revolution being financed by the Kun-Loeb cabal, and which was to follow him. The State Department papers herein show he knew every move in advance and did nothing about it. About 5 months after Kerensky became Russian premier, the Bolsheviks took over. The wrecking red work of Jewish Kerensky during his time in office is described in part as follows. In the above NY State Lusk report, the liberal decrees of the provisional government had destroyed the discipline of the army, and the disintegration of the once powerful Russian military machine became complete. From page 219, then on to page 215, it reads, Kerensky's Social Democrats distributed hundreds of thousands of leaflets among Russian soldiers, urging that the soldiers should disobey their officers and lay down their arms. End quote. The swift success of the final revolution was attributed in large measure by Lenin to a fortuitous cooperation between contending groups and factions. Note that Lenin's real name was Ulyanov, spelled Ulyanov. His father was a Mongol origin, and his mother a German Jewess. Title: Kronstadt. The Great Mutiny of the Kronstadt sailors of July 16th through 17th in 1917 is chronicled in modern encyclopedias as a red revolutionary event. Kronstadt is an island 21 miles from Petrograd, now Leningrad, in the Gulf of Finland. On July 16th, 1917, Kerensky has come home from the front when Milyakov's cadet party ministers resign. And the next day, July 17th, 1917, we see that the Bolshevik turmoil is used as the ostensible grievance for Kerensky to demobilize 2 regiments at the front. Enter Trotsky. With Kerensky having conveniently departed for the front, Trotsky harangues the crowd. The Cossacks, who are anti-Jew, are unable to prevail. Chamberlain, in the Russian Revolution of 1917 through 1921, describes the march of the 20,000 sailors who disembarked from Kronstadt and marched through Petrograd, shooting into homes and killing people on the pretext that they had been attacked. The roaring bloody days of July 16th and 17th left the people helpless at the hands of the bloodthirsty demonstrators. So the city was really at the mercy of the demonstrators, says Chamberlain, Volume 1, page 173. He also says, quote, The Kronstadt sailors marched through the main streets of Petrograd, They promptly broke into houses from which shots were supposed to have come and killed with scant ceremony anyone whom they suspected of shooting. 5 people were killed and 27 wounded before his eyes on Sadovnia Street, read one report by the Kantorovich. Terrorist Trotsky, whose real name is Bronstein, who was later to gouge out eyes and dismember his victims in sadistic Talmudic fashion during the Red Terror, was reported by Ambassador Francis to have aroused great enthusiasm by advocating violent measures. Kronstadt was a rehearsal leading up to the ripe time for takeover in November of 1917, several months later. Trotsky had been living in New York, editing the Russian communist paper Novy Mir, which means New World, financed by the Communist Garland Fund, directed by Jacob Schiff's rabbinical protege, Rabbi Judah Magnes, and such leading communists as William Z. Foster and Roger W. Dunn, Sidney Hillman, Norman Thomas, and others, serving on the Red Revolutionary battlefield in this country. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson heard about the abdication of the Tsar's government of March 15, 1917, and hailed it. The pretense then, on the part of stooges like Alexander Kerensky and other Jews, was that a democratic revolution had been successful and that humanity was to profit from it. The weak Tsar, under the thumb of his Jewish bankers and occult Rasputin, having been a pushover achieved by Jewish finance for Jewish power objectives. The scholar Jennings Wise has written in Woodrow Wilson, Apostle of Revolution, quote, on page 647, Woodrow Wilson, despite the efforts of the British police, made it possible for Leon Trotsky to enter Russia on an American passport, end quote. In document 5, we see that Lenin got 315,000 marks in June 1917, just before the Kronstadt Revolutionary rehearsal. As the note of our ambassador states, quote, Kronstadt, the Navy base, was the nerve center from which L's, referring to Lenin's, activities radiated during the summer, end quote. The funds originated from the Diskonto Gesellschaft Bank, one of the Jewish-controlled German D banks, which helped finance the Bolshevik takeover. You may see, by referring to the 1943 Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, that the so-called D banks of Germany were all run by Jews, including the Diskonto Gesellschaft and Dutch Bank, all being part of the conspiracy. In September 1917, Kronstadt is notified that the order to give passports and 207,000 marks, as per order of you, Mr. Lenin, have been handed to persons mentioned in your letter. The selection met with approval of His Excellency, the Ambassador. Ira Nelson Morris was Jewish U.S. Ambassador to Sweden at the time. Title: The Jewish financing has long been planned. As Documents 1 and 2 in Exhibit 251 show, the revolutionary setup and the banking credits were all ready to function in 1914. And Document 3 at Exhibit 252 specifically names the Diskonto, Gesellschaft, and Dutch banks in this 1914 conspiracy. Exhibit 253 of February 23, 1915, reports the work of the revolution, with W. Warburg chiefly works from Stockholm, where Jewish Ira Nelson Morris was U.S. ambassador from July 1914 until 1922. The, quote, Rhenish Industrial Syndicate of Document 5 advises the Nya Banken in Stockholm and the Stockholm representatives of the two Jewish-run D banks of Germany that they are to give money for revolutionary propaganda against Russia. Ambassador Francis detailed in Exhibit 251 documents showing that, in the name of the German government, agencies had been set up in such Finnish borders, towns as Luleå, Haparanda, and Varda, also in Bergen in Amsterdam that, quote, very close and absolutely secret relations are being established with Finnish and American banks. In this connection, the ministry begs to recommend the Swedish Banken in Stockholm, the banking office of Fredensborg, the commercial company Waldemar Hansen in Copenhagen, which are maintaining close relations with Russia, end quote. Francis adds, quote, note, this is an outline of basic financial structure begun in February 1914, 5 months before war was launched and still in operation. Notice reappearance in subsequent Lenin messages. Towns Luleå and Varda likewise reference to American banks. Olaf Ashberg, one of the heads of the Banken, came to Petrograd a month ago and boasted that NB Banken was the Bolshevik bank, end quote. The Guaranteed Trust Company of New York is mentioned, and Furstenberg under the name of Gonitsky and Ashberg are cited as intergroup members apt to run the Bolshevik state bank. Looking at the map of Sweden, you may see that the north, where Sweden joins Finland, and the Gulf of Bothnia ends. Washing both shores, there is a little border town of Haparanda, and south of it is Luleå, also on the Gulf with Russia of today, a short trek to the east across Finland. Those were chosen for the arms running to the Bolsheviks. The Imperial and D banks of Germany, in the political saddle, in cahoots with the Jewish U.S. ambassador to Sweden, Ira Morris, and the Red Revolutionary Jews, armed with endless funds, put over the job. The Jewish network touched everywhere. Title: Furstenberg at Stockholm. Stockholm was a cozy place those days for the Reds, with the USA Jewish ambassador, friendly to Jewry's aims. There are the banking office of Furstenberg and the Swedish Banken in Stockholm are mentioned in Document 1, Exhibit 251, and that was February 14th of 1914. Document 8 of Exhibit 254 is written to Mr. Furstenberg and is from the representative of the Dutch, one of the German D banks in Switzerland. He is writing Furstenberg, June 16, 1917, to tell him that Bolshevik pamphlets costing 32,000 francs, in parentheses, Swiss francs were the highest of all exchange value, in parentheses, have been sent, and he would like to know when they arrive. Maximalist is used throughout the reports, meaning Bolshevik. Furstenberg, in good approved communist style, addresses his letter in Document 9 of Exhibit 254 to Raphael Shalnikar as Dear Comrade, stating, quote, the office of the banking house M. Warburg has opened, an account for the undertaking of Comrade Trotsky, end quote. The arms have been purchased and sent a, quote, person authorized to receive the money demanded by Comrade Trotsky, end quote. Ambassador Francis noted that this communication connected Trotsky with banker Warburg and with Furstenberg. Furstenberg was a busy Jew those days, sending messages of cheer. Document 10, in Exhibit 255, is to Bolshevik military leader Antonov at Harparanda, telling him that Comrade Trotsky's request has been carried out, and that a trusty Bolshevik, Sonia, will be coming to hand him 400,000 kroner. We also see that note of Ambassador Francis in Document 10, Exhibit 255, quote, this letter from Scheiderman, the German socialist leader, links him with Furstenberg Gonitsky, with the Banken, and with subsidizing the Russian Revolution. Trotsky published a paper during the summer. Another paper spoke for Lenin. Vorwärts would seem to refer to the socialist organ at Berlin. End quote. Elsewhere, in Exhibit 253, we see the name of Max Warburg, of M.M. Warburg Bankers of Hamburg, and related to the Loeb Warburgs of the USA. As previously mentioned, Max Warburg, later in 1939, came from Germany and served on the American Jewish Committee, Peace Committee, which drew up and organized the United Nations. Its charter and its propaganda network consummated at San Francisco in 1945. Note that Warburg is cited in this Exhibit 253 as one of the three Jewish bankers, Rubinstein, Max Warburg, and Parvus, who maneuvered with the Russian revolutionaries, Zinzinov and Lunacharsky. Ambassador Francis noted that, quote, Parvus and Warburg both figure in the Lenin and Trotsky documents, end quote. Title: The Bolsheviks Take Over. When the army was disintegrating, Premier Kerensky, knowing all the time what was to follow, was fluttering with small talk when the takeover by the Red Murderers came in November 1917. The day of the coup d'etat, November 7th, 1917, Ambassador Francis communicated with Lansing, telling him that the Secretary of the Embassy, Sheldon Whitehouse, had met Kerensky, hurrying out of the Petrograd, and acknowledging that the Bolsheviks held the city and the ministers of his government would be arrested. From then on, the reports go like this, quote, all ministers arrested except Kerensky. Bolsheviki took possession of Winter Palace, where all ministers except Kerensky were located. All ministers except Kerensky in Peter and Paul Fortress, end quotes. Conflicting reports screen Kerensky's safe exit, not a hair of his head being harmed. Kerensky later retired to New York to live graciously after performing his part in the Russian Red Revolution. It is plain to see from the State Department papers that at first Ambassador Francis saw the German money financing the Bolsheviks as just that, and nothing more. He sensed, however, that a general European revolution was being fomented, and his information came from the files of Kontrraзвedka, government secret service organized under Kerensky. Concerning this, Ambassador Francis stated in February 1918, quote, if so, unavoidable questions arise why Kerensky did not use evidence against Bolsheviki last July. Many clues lead to Stockholm and Copenhagen, end quote. The Universal Jewish Encyclopedia boasts of the Jews who led the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. From page 670 from Soviet Russia, quote, the political revolution of March 1917 brought about the complete emancipation of the Russian Jews. Individual revolutionary leaders of Jewish origin, such as Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Sverdlov, played a conspicuous part in the Revolution of November 1917, which enabled the Bolsheviks to take possession of the state apparatus. End quote. The great majority of Jews were socialist Bundists, socialist Mensheviks, and were further informed, all of whom had worked for the overthrow of the Christian government of Russia. Title: Consequent Anti-Semitism. It followed in the fight between the Christian elements of the Bolshevik Jews and their dupes, as the same source states that, quote, wherever the Civil War was fought, the whites identified the Jews with the Bolsheviks and singled them out for attack. From the first, anti-Semitism was severely condemned by the Bolsheviks. The recuperative process, which set in with the end of the Civil War, was furthered by the new economic policy adopted in the spring of 1921. By 1924, nearly one-third of all the stores in Moscow were owned by Jews. End quote, from page 674 of the encyclopedia. From our embassy in Russia came the report of conditions appalling, veritable slaughter. Men are shot without trial from September 21st, 1918, and Bloody Delirium, now reigning in Moscow and Petrograd, from September 25th of 1918, page 694 of the State Department. In Exhibit 260, we have a typical report from those on the ground, a communication from the U.S. Consul General at Moscow to the Secretary of State, May 2nd, 1918, quote, Jews predominant in local Soviet government, anti-Jewish feeling grows among population, which tends to regard oncoming Germans as deliverers, end quote. Another State Department report during this period, found in Exhibit 261, notes, quote, 50% of Soviet government in each town consists of Jews of the worst type, many of whom are anarchists, end quote. Title: The Mysterious Odendijk Report. Students of the communist movement are bound to run across the story of how M. Odendijk, Netherlands minister in Russia at the time of the Russian Revolution, had warned the British and French governments that communism is Jewish, but that this warning had been carefully deleted from the official British papers on the subject. Odendijk had taken over British affairs in Russia at the time. It may be asserted that such a report never existed, yet here it is, printed in 1931 as part of the USA State Department papers, and reproduced as Exhibits 256 through 259. The Odendijk report is long. I have reproduced not all of it, but enough so that the context of his warning is clear. Odendijk's communique went to various governments, including our own, and included, quote, from Exhibits 258 and 259, The danger is now so great that I feel it my duty to call the attention of the British and all other governments to the fact that if an end is not put to Bolshevism in Russia, at once the civilization of the whole world will be threatened. This is not an exaggeration. Consider that the immediate suppression of Bolshevism is the greatest issue now before the world. Not even excluding the war, which is still raging, and unless as above the stated Bolshevism is nipped in the bud immediately, it is bound to spread in one form or another over Europe and the whole world, as it is organized and worked by Jews who have no nationality and whose one object is to destroy their own ends and their existing order of things. End quote. Odendijk's prophetic warnings went unheeded. How Jewish pressure was brought to bear to remove Allied forces, fighting with the anti-communist whites in Russia is still another story. Bloody Trotsky and Lenin were armed and financed to clean up the job initiated by Jewish Kerensky in Russia when under sadistic totalitarian anti-Christian Jewish-controlled enslavement, with more countries to follow until now the entire world is threatened. Title: The Jews Gloat. At the celebration of the 1917 triumph of Jewry at Carnegie Hall in New York, it was proudly told how Jacob Schiff had financed communist propaganda spread among 50,000 Russian war prisoners in Jew-financed Japan, which sent them back to attempt putting over the 1905 Red Revolution in their Russian homeland. Not only are the agent connections of Schiff with the Japanese war against Russia hailed in his Kahila sketch, and his agent ties to chronicled elsewhere in aid of every phase of the Talmudic plan, his own words bear witness to his deeds. As the State Department communications herein show, Schiff and his Jewish cohorts were, at the time of the Carnegie Hall meeting, financing the bloody terrorist Trotsky and Lenin to finish off the job instituted and furthered under Kerensky. To further quote the 1917 New York Times report, quote, an authority on Russian affairs, George Kennan, told of a movement by the Society of the Friends of Russian Freedom, financed by Jacob H. Schiff, which had, at the time of the Russo-Japanese War, spread among 50,000 Russian officers and men in Japanese prison camps, the gospel of the Russian revolutionist. The movement was financed by a New York banker you all know and love, he said, referring to Mr. Schiff. And soon we received 1.5 tons of Russian revolutionary propaganda. At the end of the war, 50,000 Russian officers and men went back to their country, ardent revolutionists. Mr. Parsons then arose and said, "I will now read a message from White Sulphur Springs, sent by the gentleman to whom Mr. Keenan referred." This was the message. "Will you say for me to those present at tonight's meeting how deeply I regret my inability to celebrate with the friends of Russian freedom the actual reward of what we had hoped and striven for these long years." End quote. This was followed by pious hopes that a proper government and constitution which shall permanently assure to the Russian people happiness and peace, and the signature, Jacob H. Schiff. By what followed, we know what Schiff meant as a proper government. The New York Times report of the great Carnegie Hall celebration of the Russian Revolution was subtitled, "Rabbi Wise, Ready for War," relates how Jacob H. Schiff financed revolution propaganda in Tsar's army. To quote, "Then the rabbi praised the Russian Revolution. I cannot forget," continued the rabbi, "that I am a member and a teacher of a race of which half has lived in the domain of the Tsar, and as a Jew, I believe that all of the achievements, none has been nobler than the part the sons and daughters of Israel have taken in the greater movement which has culminated in the free Russia." End quote. To his dying day, Rabbi Stephen Wise, a tireless Red, never waned in his enthusiasm for the Soviet slave state, the murderer of so many millions of Christians. Quote from the New York Times, "At the close of the meeting, pictures of the revolutionary leaders were shown upon the screen." End quote. Okay, everybody, that does it for Chapter 12. Next is Chapter 13 on modern Jewish anti-communism. Thank you all for listening, and catch you next time.